Yep, morning everyone. I'm a bit surprised there's so many people here, but there you go. Where to start really about dams and imperialism, water imperialism. I think I should explain the handouts. Don't worry about the back of it, they're just scrap paper. One of it is just a bit of a map to give a bit of an idea of where Tibet and Nepal actually sits and where the Himalayas are. The other I just thought was a little bit interesting. I mean, I mentioned about whether the conflicts. It's a bit hard to see the shading. I know that, but the top one, weapon, is not referring to the use of weapons. It's when water has been a weapon in conflict somewhere. So I'll talk a little bit about that. The casualty is just where because of a conflict, the water has been a casualty and some kind of way availability of it. And the other is the trigger, which is that's where you see such a big increase over the last little while of water and water scarcity, etc. has created a whole bunch of conflicts. I suppose one of the reasons I think they're doing. We see the climate crisis here a lot in terms of individual things, the bushfires, the floods, the cyclones. Separate from day-to-day life in some way. We don't really see the way, I think, in which the climate crisis and the consequent climate crisis are really integrated into the crisis of capitalism. I think that becomes a little more obvious, hopefully, as we go over things. But so we see, as I said, we see cyclones, floods, algal blooms in the Murray-Darling, algal blooms in the around Adelaide, and they seem like episodic and catastrophes in one respect or another, but not necessarily existential thing. And I do think anyway that's part of the rationale to go over. I think how the two things are, how they're really kind of integrated. I'll explain what the handout is. I mean, one of the things which is one little incident in there, because we don't see very often either where there's actually an explicit struggle about climate. That you can actually point to say, here's where people are actually struggling against the question of climate change. But maybe people here know about the Boquilla Dam, in Mexico. I didn't actually until I started ferreting around. But Boquilla Dam is on the border between Mexico and the US. And in 2022, farmers actually occupied the dam to prevent water being released to the United States, because as so often is the case, the dam. Partly funded by the US. One of the deals of the dam is actually I forgot what the figure is now. 70% of the water. There's a certain amount that meant to be released, to the United States. But the dam is now only 14% full. Like you've had a drought for I've forgotten exactly how long. But in 2022, it got to the point where it was simply an existential question for the farmers in the area that whether they're going to have any water or not. They occupied it. It's unresolved now. Donald Trump, no one's going to be surprised by that, is actually demanding the water actually still be released to the United States, and part of the threats about tariffs, Mexico is also associated with demands about the water. When we first started thinking about the talk, actually, it was about Iran. Because it's also one of the other examples which I knew of from being involved in the refugee campaign, actually a water revolution. People from Awas would talk about a water revolution and why they'd actually come, because there were massive demonstrations against the regime over the shortage of water, and it coincided, with the huge demonstrations in. The water revolution didn't coincide with the water revolution was back in the early 2000s. It's not been the only one actually. Since the water revolution, which did send a heap of refugees, we've seen in Kyrgyzstan there's similarly where there have been demonstrations where people would chant, "We are thirsty, we are thirsty." Because of the water shortages, and so there are some of the places around Iran where rivers that used to be tourist attractions, you can just walk from one side to the other now. Now that's another story which I'm not going to go into a lot, but the fact that prior to the huge demonstrations in January, the government was actually talking about evacuating Tehran because of the water shortage. And it gives you some idea of the scale, of the crisis that are actually, considering, doing that. Now that's a combination both of the climate crisis and also just mismanagement, and I think one of the things which is an ongoing theme about dams is actually the way in which many of the undeveloped countries build dams. Often it's a way in which they're actually integrated into the capitalist economy, into the world economy, sometimes by having to get funding, particular funding from the World Bank, from the US, from the USSR, from China, whatever, in terms of actually building the dam. And then the process of building the dam is what gives them jobs, irrigation, the possibility of agriculture, for those countries themselves to become players in the capitalist system. And that's got everything to do with the fact that they are talking about capitalist development. Very often you see after the creation of dams, the production in a particular country goes from being subsistence, if you like, to cash crops in order to sustain national economy on the world on the world stage. We've seen a little bit of that ourselves. I mean, the Snowy Mountain scheme, which I'm not going to talk about at all, but we're seen as a nation-building scheme. We're going to turn the rivers from the east to the west to irrigate the west, to develop agriculture, etc. The Hoover Dam, similarly, built in '36. It was a way of dealing with the depression. It was jobs. It was irrigation. It was industrialisation. etc., that went along with that. And to give a little bit of a flavour, in some of the things you read about it, they'll talk about dams as being an algorithm of sovereignty. That the actual creation of dams is a way in which these countries can actually establish them as part of the world capitalist economy. So you can see a little bit of that in the figures. Like in 1950 there were 5,000 dams. Mostly we're talking about dams that are over 15 metres high. There are actually millions of dams of some kind or one kind or another. But we're talking about major dams that are registered. So 1950 there were 5,000. 75% of them were in advanced capitalist countries. By 2000, so it's 50 years, there were 45,000. But there are 45,000 in 140 countries. And some of that is to do with the fact that, particularly after the decolonisation which took place after the Second World War, we saw quite a rapid expansion of dams in various countries. By 2026, there are actually 64,000. It's a bit slowed up a little bit in one respect, and that's not surprising. The dams have got a fairly long life, but 22,000 of them are actually in China. So we've seen like a massive expansion of the dams, and I've said they play a particular role of drawing the countries into the capitalist economy, and then playing their own role once they've established that. But it's all about economic development, how it can get economic development. So what I'm going to do now is actually talk about a few examples, I think, which demonstrate the issues about dams and imperialism and the way they fit into the world economy. And that's partly why the map doesn't go where it needs to go, which needs to go across, sort of to encompass Turkey and to Egypt, which I'm going to start with Egypt anyway. But that little patch of the world, there's 17 countries. There are amongst, or perhaps are, the most water stressed in the world. And for some of them, they're talking about, if you talk about Iraq and Iran, they're actually saying that it could be a 4 degrees increase in average temperature by 2050. Now 2050 is not very far away. And I used to think it was a long way away, but I don't anymore. So it's not so it gives you a bit of an idea of the scale of, the uneven ways in which the climate crisis is actually affecting different areas of the world, but in particular, the sharp effect that it's happening in that particular part of the world. So just looking at the Aswan Dam, it was in Egypt. It was a long time in the making, but it's a very good example of both of Egypt as a developing economy, building the dam for all the reasons that I've already been over, but the way in which it clashes with imperialism. most stridently. For Egypt, it was seen as a way of developing the electricity generation, industrialising, changing agriculture. And at first, it was being funded by the UK and the US. That was part of where Egypt, called itself neutral country, trying to balance between, Russia and the US. The US was, anxious to try and keep it outside and out of the Russian camp. Now, I'm not going to go into all the ins and outs of that, but it is not a coincidence that 19th of July, partly it's because NASA responds to Israeli aggression. Actually, the US doesn't like that. Threatens them about the funding. So if you're not going to actually be neutral and behave yourself, then funding for the dam may be at risk. And in 19th of July 1956, they actually pull the funding on the dam. The 26th of July, NASA nationalises the Suez Canal. It nationalises the Suez Canal and to get the money to actually build the dam. And we nationalised the canal. People who use the canal, which is mostly developed countries, that we're going to do that. Now, don't people here know a bit about UK and France invade? Both Russia and US don't like that idea, particularly want to try and keep their own little hands on Egypt. So eventually they withdraw and the canal is nationalised. But make a long story short, the USSR then funds the Aswan Dam as a way of pulling Egypt into its fold. Now, filmed in the other thing I should say, which I think is an indicator, 15% of villages in Egypt first got electricity out of the Aswan Dam. That's part of that question of the national development. But now, again, people might be familiar with it, but the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is actually being built on the Blue Nile, and this has created quite a crisis particularly between Egypt and Ethiopia, because now you've got a dam upstream from Egypt and Sudan, which is actually bigger than the Aswan Dam. The dam has the possibilities of restricting water, particularly in droughts. The Aswan Dam, there's already issues about the Aswan Dam itself in terms of what it's done as far as irrigation and things in the rest of Egypt. One of the interesting things actually is that one of the consequences of putting the dam is that it stopped the floods, which was part of the idea of that's what they wanted, the dam to stop the floods, but it meant that the silt that they came down the Nile, which provided extra fertilisation, etc., for the places that were affected by the floods, stopped happening. But interesting, one of the consequences of that, not just they had to use fertiliser, that's another story, but it affected the fish. Actually, the fish in the Mediterranean Sea, the fish catch dropped almost 60% because the nutrients that were coming from the silt didn't get to the sea anymore. So the fish catch dropped. Now you've got it's increased a little bit because the use of fertiliser has meant that some of the nutrients are going back now. That's another story. But it still means, because the silt is not clearing the delta of the Nile anymore, that the delta is blocking up and the salinisation is starting to... Anyway, I don't want to get too carried away with that. But the Ethiopia has built the Grand Renaissance Dam for the same reason that Egypt built the Aswan Dam. Its concern is to create jobs, national development, have electricity. It's very hopeful that that development will make it something of a regional power. It's hoping that it can export electricity to Kenya, Djibouti, to Sudan. Also hoping that its industrial development is going to enable it to get access to the sea, which it hasn't been able to do so far. Okay, so that's one little example of the way in which the dams and the creation of the dams, the national self-development, which seems to make sense from their point of view, but has actually created huge amounts of tension between the two. Ethiopia has actually refused to sign a drought agreement about how the water will be shared between Ethiopia and Egypt, and so consequently you've got serious political conflict between the two. The next example I use is actually the Himalayas, and that's why the map's there a little bit. And I think there's a couple of ways in which this comes up. First of all, the consequences of climate change, is already having its impact. As I said before, you're talking about this 17 of the driest countries in that particular area, but it's also, in the last 26 years, we've seen a dramatic fall off in snow melt, and what that has meant is that the source of the water that they used to be able to rely on, coming from the Himalayas, and that area, the whole Tibetan plateau is called the third pole, because of the amount of fresh water that actually is similar to the Arctic and the Antarctic in terms of the amount of water which is actually contained, on the Earth. But because of the climate change and because of the actions in the East Coast China and India, you'll see it's now also becoming a flashpoint of political and military tensions. China has built I think it is the biggest dam in the world, or will be the biggest dam in the world. It's called the Yalang Changpo. Mostly in English it's called the Great Bend Dam, and it's built only about I think it's only about 12 miles from the Indian border. But the consequence is going to be it's going to take most of the water that is going to India and push it back, similarly with Surrey Mountain Scheme, back into China. So again, the tensions between India and China, it's not the only place. I mean, China's got a whole history, because when you look at where the water actually comes from, the water runs from China. Its control of Tibet means the water runs east towards Asia, the Mekong. There's big issues, but China's control over the dams that go into the Mekong and the water going the other way. But I think the point that I want to make about the dam is that India, in response to the Great Bend Dam, is actually building 200 dams below where the Indian dam is, because of their concern that China's control of the water, which would otherwise be going into India, is going to be cut off, or could be cut off. Now, those dams are actually being funded by the US and by Japan, but India sees it and argues for it in the same kind of way that China's argued for it. They see hydroelectricity as green energy. China argues for it. It's a way of creating green energy to deal with fossil fuels and carbon emissions, but at the same time, what it's actually using, that for is to actually a huge expansion of AI and data centers and things like that. Okay. So the 200 dams. Oh, okay. I'm going to speed up here a bit. Okay. I won't go through some of the other examples. The 200 dams are argued for quite explicitly as a way of being able to militarily and ecologically respond, to the threat from China. Okay, I'll rush through some of the other ones. India and Pakistan. Again, you look at if you want to understand why Kashmir is a flashpoint, then you need to understand water actually, because Pakistan relies on the Indus. Pakistan relies on Indus for 90% of its food production. But India has suspended the treaty which between Pakistan and India about how the water was going to be divided in 2025. I could go through lots of other examples that are similarly, but one of the ones I wanted to deal with is with Turkey, which you want to see an instance where a very explicit military use of dams and of water supply. You see Turkey's opposition to Kurdistan and to Kurdish resistance. For a whole long period, it was prepared to bomb dams, to redirect dams, to use water shortages, to create water shortages, to displace Kurds from one area to another. It's been one of those very explicit ways in which the control of dams has actually been used militarily. But we're now seeing it take a little step beyond that, because there's again another huge dam project. There's building 22 dams and 19 power stations, but they're cutting the Tigris and the Euphrates. Now people know where the Tigris and Euphrates actually go. The dams that have already cut 80% of the water to Iraq and 40% of the water to Syria. So Turkey's used its control of the water, both explicitly in terms of the Kurds and, well, also explicitly in terms of its relationship with Iraq and Syria. If you want to know why Turkey is becoming a sub-imperialist player in the Middle East, again, you need to look at the way in which dams are actually a player in that process. I won't go through some of the other examples. They're all similarly, I think, to actually look at the role that dams have actually played and how they explicitly play that role. I did go through Marx's I looked through the question of metabolic rift and Marx's understanding of the metabolic rift. He doesn't really refer. I couldn't find. I'm happy to be corrected. Couldn't find that there was much about water. Except in the sense that complains bitterly about the way in which the Thames is used and just becomes a sewer to take the excrement out of London into the into the sea. But it's very clear, I think, that when you think about the metabolic, could easily have been talking about water and the access to water and the extent to which water and access to water and fresh water, both in terms of agriculture, both in terms of human life, etc., is critical in the same kind of way. He wrote about Ireland. He says, for a century and a half, England has indirectly exported the soil of Ireland without as much as allowing its cultivators the means for making up the constituents of the soil that has been exhausted. Talking explicitly about the way in which colonial exploitation of Ireland had degraded the ecology of Ireland. And hopefully we've been over some of the ways in which the dams played the similar kind of role. But I think one of the reasons for going through it is that, like I again said earlier, we're not talking about separate struggles. And even when we talk about the poly crisis, that there's an economic crisis, an ecological crisis, and a political crisis. There's no China walls between those. The things are actually integrated. And when you more than integrated, I think it's impossible. They're inextricably linked. That's probably a better way of putting it. And so even when we don't often see explicit struggles about climate. And frankly, I don't think we're likely to. There may be episodic times in which it'll become an issue, but when the people in Mexico occupied the dam, they weren't thinking, I'm doing something about climate change. They were thinking, I had to occupy this dam because of the consequences it had for my existence, the irrigation, our future, etc., etc. And I think that's part of the way in which we need to understand it. The Kurdish people that saw the displacement and the use of water certainly as a weapon, but when they're fighting the Turkish government or whoever before Kurdish independence and control of their land and self-determination, it's not put in terms of climate change. But I think there is a role for socialists to actually pull those two things together, because hopefully it's fairly clearer the way in which the climate crisis is a force multiplier for the general crisis for the general crisis in capitalism. And I think that's the way we need to see it. Although there may not be separate struggles, immediate struggles over climate, the questions of dams, the control of water, the way in which imperialism and capitalism is interwoven with that national development and creates imperialist competition, is critical to it. So they're not separate from capitalist crisis. Actually, it is capitalist crisis, and I think that's the way that we need to understand it. That it intensifies the struggles. The climate crisis intensifies the struggles and the class struggles we see, but it's not just a question of settling accounts with our immediate rulers. It is a question about the future of the planet. And in that respect, I'll finish with another quote from Marx, which again talking about the metabolic rift. The way that the cultivation of particular crops depends on fluctuations in market prices and the constant change in cultivation with these prices, the entire spirit of capitalist production, which is oriented towards the most immediate monetary profits, stands in contradiction to agriculture, which has to concern itself with the whole gamut of permanent conditions of life required by the chain of successive generations. And in that respect, that's the fight that we're involved in. An immediate fight over the control of society, the capacity to actually do something about climate change, means that we have to deal with the capitalist crisis. We have to deal with the world capitalist system. The fight against climate change is a fight against the capitalist system.